This is from the website thewaythetruthandthelife.net. I have spent a week converting this book from text to spoken word so that you could listen to it. Let me tell you why this is so important. This book interests me because it has an accurate history by many men that were murdered in the process. And they were priests and were communicating in writing about their activities. And these writings have been used in this book to give a cited record of what happened from the French priest perspective. Those that went, they went with nothing, 2 by 2, nothing but the shirt on their back. And I'll tell you why that's important, because I experienced a different spirit in people. My father was killed in a train hit the car when I was 12. Lived in a farm town between Niagara Falls and Lockport, New York. And 2 years later, my mother was married. I spent a year. My older brother was living with my grandparents, and he came back after my mother remarried. We moved to Buffalo, suburb of Buffalo, and I wasn't needed anymore. And I told her that summer I was 14, I'm going back to the farm town. And she says, no, you can't go. She says, you can't run away. I said, I'm not running away, I'm telling you. She says, you can't go. I said, what are you going to do, tie me to the bedpost? I'm going. And so I did. I hitchhiked 20 miles back to Pekin, New York. That's just 2 miles from the Tuscarora Reservation. When I was a boy around 4 years old, 3 when we moved there, we had to go to the Tuscarora Indian Reservation to get our drinking water from a spring there. We lived on this escarpment, the cliff over which Niagara Falls flows, that goes out 20 or more than 20 miles past Lockport. At any rate, you couldn't drill a well on the top of that cliff and get water very easily. So we didn't have well water. And we would get water from the Indian reservation. So that was my first experience. But then when I learned that the Indians that were living there were not the original Indians, that they had taken, that was the neuter tribe. And those were the ones that the myth of the Maid of the Mist came from. But the Iroquois were jealous and vengeful. They had been slaves and freed, and they were acting the way to everybody else that they had been treated. But they had torture racks and they had cannibalism. They took the 2 priests that had converted the neuter tribe, that when they heard Jesus preached, and they put them on posts and tied them to posts and put fires under their legs. And one kept preaching Jesus. They cut out his tongue and his lips. They cut flesh off their legs while they were there, tied to the post and bleeding, and ate it. And then they went on to exterminate the neuter tribe. That's the noble savage for you. But at any rate, this book has a very accurate message. And why it speaks to me is after my father was killed, as I said, I went back to this Pekin and worked on a farm for the summer. Then Jimmy Reynolds and I hitchhiked out to Illinois, to Chanute Field, where Roger Chaplin was in the Air Force. And we visited him and then hitchhiked back to Pennsylvania and filled the woodshed for my grandparents and come home. Well, I returned home for school and went to school. That I turned 15 in September 13. And I went to school that winter, and then in the summer I went back again and worked on Hoover's Dairy. Lived with Frank Clough. But At the end of the summer, I went to Arizona. Roger was stationed at Davis-Monthan Air Base in Tucson, Arizona. We went down to Nogales, and then on the way back, I got a ride, and I was down into Juarez, and uh, my experiences spoke a lot to me. And then I turned 16 and quit school, worked, falsified my birth certificate, and worked in a factory until Christmas time. And at 16, I went on the road selling magazines after Christmas, a different city every week. The first time I got out as far as Wisconsin and hitchhiked home. The second time I got out as far as Denver and hitchhiked home, and I come home and worked until I was old enough to go in the Air Force. At any rate, the first 2 years I went with no money, nothing. Picked up pop bottles. You got 2 cents a bottle if you turn them in. And I met a warm, caring spirit in so many people. I met boys that wanted me to join in some criminal activity. I just said it was against my religion. I met men who wanted to have homosexual activity. I said, no, it was just against my religion. And they left me alone. Well, when I went on the road selling magazines, living in hotels, a different city every week, it was a different world. When I went dressed up with money in my pocket and selling something, I met a different world than when I went with nothing. And for that reason, I understood why Jesus told his apostles, the 12 originally, to go with nothing but the shirt on their back. And then he said this, essentially the same thing to the 70 that he sent in Luke chapter 10, and he prayed for more of the same. And you can read in Revelations that we are all kings and priests to God through Christ. And the background there is pretty simple. We're all doing human sacrifice in history. Read about it in the internet nowadays. That in my own Swedish culture, up until 1,000 years after Christ, they were doing regular human sacrifice. In my wife Olga's home country of Russia, they did sacrifice 1,000 years after Christ too, human sacrifice. So that, and the sacrifice of children as a way of getting rid of them. The abortion now, they're murdering all they want. It's legal murder. But what they did in many places, they either threw the babies off a cliff, and historically I'm talking, or left them out in the woods for the animals to eat, or threw them in the creek to let them drown. That they got rid of a lot of babies. And one of the things the more sophisticated ones did was to sacrifice their children by burning them in a fire to some idol. That was the background for Abraham. Abraham's father made idols that people would buy and sacrifice to. Abraham rebelled against that, and he rebelled against child sacrifice. He was the example, and he started a culture. That's what God's chosen people are, people that don't do child sacrifice. And so they went on to Egypt, where Pharaoh had the power to have the babies murdered. But afterwards, Moses had the 10 Commandments from God that even Pharaoh was guilty of murder, that he had to respect these laws. So that was a great contribution. Then we had the contribution of Joshua. There were tribes that were doing child sacrifice, and they were also murdering the Jews. They eliminated them. They exterminated the evil cultures so that it would be a safe place for children to live. So that was the foundation. Then they set up a priesthood to educate people and to train them so they could protect this culture. And the priests made themselves big umpty-umps, and the sacrifices, they were respected, that they were the only ones that could go through the veil to God. God is everything. Matter is not created or destroyed. Space is not created or destroyed. The energy that moves matter is not created or destroyed. This is God's physical substance from which we are all formed, like creating a hat, not poof something out of nothing. So this is the background. And where Jesus come in, he said, you can go directly to the source of your existence, God. And the priests resented that so much that they had the Roman authority murder Jesus, and he became the Christ, the sacrifice for all men, that we can go directly to our source of existence. It says the veil in the temple was torn in two when he died, when he expired. And that meant that the Holy of Holies was open to all people to communicate with their source of existence. Now, and then Jesus said to his servants, go and take nothing but the shirt on your back. And I learned how important that was. And this book shows that that's true. Even the French priests, if they would go with nothing but the shirt on their back, 2 by 2, and tell about Jesus opening heaven, that we could all communicate with our source of existence, the doors were open, a different spirit. I've met that spirit when I went with nothing. I met that spirit in Russia when I went and didn't have the correct documents. I met that spirit in Ukraine when I was taken off a train and deported alone with nothing. And all the help I needed was there. I received that spirit when I totaled my car in 2011 going to Washington to testify at the Food and Drug Administration against electroconvulsive treatments, equivalent to dropping a 14-pound baby off a 10-foot high building, or three pistol slugs to the head, and they're getting $2,500 of treatment, and they have a series of at least 20 that they involve you in. So we're talking $50,000, and it's experimental hazardous. It wouldn't even be legal if it hadn't been used before the laws were written, and they keep trying to make it legal because it's so profitable, and it's just doing damage to the nerve connections, so a person forgets what they were concerned about. They don't know who they are for a while, but then the suicide rate goes back. That's a whole nother thing. So here's this book, and it shows very clearly both going with that spirit, but then it shows how it gets corrupted into a priesthood again. The same thing that Jesus was against, that we could go directly to our source of existence, that they reestablish a priesthood. But that's another issue. But I valued this book so much, I spent a week with the Google digitized, and I had that text read and recorded, all 27 chapters. So that is in the section here on YouTube with the comments or my introduction. A link to where you can go on the internet and have this whole book read to you, or you can read it. Thank you.